Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox, and thanks for logging on. If you love this watch, email me, tmosso@thewatchbox.com. Your purchase and pricing email question line for buying this or any watch you see on any Watchbox platform. That's tmosso@thewatchbox.com for pricing. Okay, today we're discussing a watch that was a supernova in 2021, and at 41 millimeters with the turquoise blue dial. This is now a discontinued variant as it was not cataloged for 2022, making it a one-year-only combination of a Tiffany turquoise blue dial and a 41 millimeter steel Oyster Perpetual. So the Oyster Perpetual was designed across the board for 2021, and this is the OP41 reference 124300. 41 millimeters in diameter in stainless steel. It is 11.7 millimeters thick, 47.5 millimeters from lug tip to lug tip, and 51.3 millimeters from end link to end link with a 21 millimeter spacing between the lugs. It should be mentioned, Rolex has its own foundry, it makes its own steel, so it constructs its own cases, bracelets, and clasps, and it uses 904L steel, which is more resistant to corrosion than conventional watchmaking 316. Like Zinn U-boat style, it does not need to be rinsed after exposure to concentrations of salt in sweat or seawater, so it's more corrosion resistant. We have a 3-link oyster-style bracelet with a pronounced taper, a conforming end link to better integrate it into the case. Satin tops, polished faces, removable links fixed by screws, and you can see we have removable links on both sides. We have a little pressed and recessed Rolex coronet on the buckle, which is a signature of the OP. You can see the top is satinated, the flank of the buckle is polished. For the first time on the OP, this generation introduces the 5mm Easy Link tool-free adjustment system, and then, as is traditional, on modern Rolex watches, you have 3 divots drilled inside the clasp, so you can use your strap tool to move the spring bar and change the anchoring point inside the clasp. The clasp and the swing arm are of thick gauge steel, and you can see in contrast to previous OPs, the clasp is internally polished, not media blasted. We have a beak and a hook system. They latch together, and they actually keep it steadfastly closed until you unlatch it by pulling up the spring-loaded lever. So this is a very sophisticated locking system that appears at first glance to be friction fit. It's anything but. The case is simple and attractive with lovely tapered lug profiles, polished case flanks, satin finished lug hoods, a screw-down twin lock crown, 100 meters water resistant, and a domed bezel, which contrasts with the conical bezel often used, for example, on steel date justs. So that domed bezel gives it a little bit of a bubble back-like look, as the OP of 1933, the first Oyster Perpetual, also nicknamed Bubbleback, combined the 1926 Oyster water-resistant case with the 1933 Perpetual rotor winding system, and in order to accommodate that rotor, the case back was made a little bit larger, creating the look of a bubble on your case back. Hence, it was nicknamed Bubbleback, and one of the signatures of that look was the domed bezel, which continues here. Not only was the original Oyster Perpetual the prototype of the modern Rolex Oyster Perpetual, it was arguably the archetype for the entire sports watch genre, being steel, highly water-resistant, and automatic winding. The dial here is that lovely turquoise blue that everyone identifies with Tiffany. The Rolex association with Tiffany ended acrimoniously in the early 1990s as Rolex objected to Tiffany's practice of placing the Tiffany name on the dial, unlike, for example, the Tiffany Pateks, which were made by Henri Stern in New York for the Tiffany retailer. The Rolex watches were signed by Tiffany without Rolex approval, and although the arrangement lasted for decades, eventually Rolex reclaimed its brand and pulled the distributorship. Ironically, Rolex nods and winks to that era of Rolex-Tiffany alliance with this turquoise blue dial, which is officially called turquoise blue, not Tiffany teal. The watch, of course, has a glossy lacquer base that appears almost wet and bottomless. Hands, crown, and indices are white gold to resist oxidation and tarnish over time. Rolex makes the whole watch, the hands, the dial, case, clasp, bracelet, movement, and of course they make their own lume, which they call chromolite. You can see that the indices are doubled at 3, 6, and 9 for better legibility. And then on the reverse side, as ever, solid case back on an Oyster case. Give you a good look at that. The watch features caliber 3230, which is an automatic winder. The rotor is on a rotor bearing in contrast to the previous 3130's jeweled staff. The rotor bearing makes it more shock tolerant. The watch now has a 70-hour power reserve. It has hacking or stop seconds. It beats away at 8 beats per second, pivots on 31 joules. It is a COSC certified Swiss chronometer, but Rolex takes that chronometer certified movement cases it up, tests it in 6 positions as an assembled watch, and certifies that it will run no worse than -2 + 2 seconds per day. That is the substantive modern meaning for the long-running term superlative chronometer on Rolex dials. Rolex uses a free-sprung balance on a full balance bridge for shock tolerance and precise adjustment, and it uses an overcoil hairspring, so no matter what position the watch is in during the testing or on your wrist, it will breathe concentrically. That is, the hairspring will breathe concentrically, and the watch will keep very even and consistent time. That hairspring is made of a blue oxidized niobium zirconium alloy Rolex calls Powerchron Blue that is also very highly anti-magnetic. So anti-magnetic, shock resistant, and water resistant. This is an all-arounder that I can recommend for a wrist as small as 15 centimeters in circumference. Doing a quick wrist shot here, you can see that the watch flares out to the edge of my wrist. I could wear it on a slightly smaller wrist. My wrist is 16. I think it would fit on a 15, but any smaller than that, if your wrist is smaller, you're going to want to go with something like an OP36. Reach out to Team Mosso at thewatchbox.com for purchase and pricing details.